Hello bookish people, welcome back to my channel. My name is Megan. In today's video we are doing another explaining the plot of, and this time we are doing it for Belladonna by Adalyn. I just finished this book this morning and I was like, I need to film explaining the plot of a video because this book was absolutely amazing. I rated it 5 stars and honestly it is perfect for one of these videos because it is part fantasy, part romance, and part murder mystery, all of my favorite things combined. And the sequel to this, Foxglove, is coming out on Tuesday. I am filming this on Saturday, so what better time to film it than before the sequel comes out so everybody can get caught up on what happened in Belladonna. This story follows Cigna and her relationship with Death, who is this enigmatic being. The book starts off showing Cigna's origin story, if you will. So we see her mother Rima, and she is carrying Cigna as a baby, showing her off at the ball, but the wine at the ball has been poisoned, so everybody ends up dying. And of course, because Cigna was breastfeeding, she should also have the poison ingested in her. So when Death comes to claim the souls of everybody there, he goes to touch Cigna and realizes he cannot claim her soul. Obviously, Cigna does not remember this because she is a baby, but her first experience with death comes at the age of 5 when she falls down the stairs and her neck breaks, meaning she should have died, but her body repairs itself and she realizes she cannot die. But she does see Death for the first time because when she is dying, the veil between them has kind of come down so she can see him, but she realizes she can see Death, but she also cannot die. Cigna has lived a life of an orphan because her parents have died. She has been passed on guardian to guardian, and she keeps getting passed on from all these different guardians because all her guardians end up dying. So there's this kind of mystery around her and people talk. They're like, oh, that's the girl, she has the devil in her. All of her guardians end up dead. But Cigna doesn't necessarily attract the best guardians because her family came from wealth. She has a huge inheritance coming her way, but until she's able to access that at a certain age, her caretakers get an allowance to take care of her every month. So that kind of attracts people who just kind of want to take advantage of her for her money. When we meet Cigna at the age we are following her through the story, she is living with her Aunt Magda, and her Aunt Magda just blows all her money and does not treat Cigna very well. While she's living with her aunt, she eats these Belladonna berries that are poisonous. She realizes when she eats these berries, she can see Death, so she views this as her way of summoning him now. Somebody who has constantly haunted her life, she now has a way to bring him to her. She tries to eat Belladonna berries again to see Death, and her aunt catches her trying to eat the berries, calls her witch, and tells her, you need to get out of my house and go sleep in the shed. So she goes to her room to pack her things, where she sees Death. So she goes up to her room to pack her things, she eats the berries, and Death arrives. But then Aunt Magda bursts into the room and they get into an altercation where Cigna pushes her and her touch causes her aunt to die. Cigna discovers that her touch alone cannot cause death on a person, but if Death is in her presence, then when she touches somebody, Death will come to them. Now that another one of her guardians has died, she needs somewhere else to go until she can access her inheritance, which is just a couple months away, and Mr. Hawthorne, Elijah, invites her to come to his manor, Thorn Grove, to stay. Elijah is married to Lillian, who is Aunt Magda's granddaughter, and they invite her to be a part of their family. Silas Thorley, a stable boy, comes to pick Cigna up from her aunt's house to take her to the manor, and they travel together, and she is a little confused by this. She's like, why would Mr. Hawthorne send a stable boy to come pick me up? While they're traveling to Thorn Grove, Silas tells her that Lillian is dead and her daughter Blythe, who is Cigna's cousin, is very sick and on the precipice of death. Silas also tells her that Lillian died from a mysterious illness, and one day she was fine and the next day she was very sick and vomiting up blood. We learn the Hawthorns make their money through a gentleman's club called Gray's, which is for high-powered men. This is how they get their money and their status. The firstborn son of each generation is the one who inherits the business and will run it. Silas and Cigna finally arrive at Thorn Grove, but before they make it up to the house, Silas gets out of the carriage and he's like, hey, it's better if you don't tell them that I traveled with you. Because of my social status, it wouldn't look right, so I'm gonna exit, don't tell anybody about this, and then just go greet the people waiting for you on the front of the steps. And the people waiting for her is Percy Hawthorne, her cousin, Marjorie Hargraves, her governess, and Charles Warwick, the butler. When she arrives at Thorn Grove, she realizes that there is a soiree happening inside the house. It is very loud, it's very boisterous, and there is a lot of partying going on in there. And she thinks this is a bit odd that there is so much partying going on a day of her arrival, and also because they are grieving the death of Lillian. Marjorie escorts Cigna to her room and tells her that she is going to be her governess and she is going to prepare her for her debut in society, which makes Cigna so happy because she's been surrounded by death her whole life. All she has wanted is a normal existence and to debut in society, find a perfectly nice husband, and live a happy life. Once they arrive to Cigna's room, Marjorie instructs her not to leave her room. But as soon as Marjorie leaves, Cigna's like, oh, but that is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to leave my room and and I have to explore this estate. When Cigna leaves her room, this is where we really start to see the cracks in Percy and his dad Elijah's relationship. She goes down to the party and she is shocked by the behavior of the attendees because it is not the prim and proper etiquette she has learned. And then Percy decides to give a speech to the room where he thanks his father for throwing endless parties in honor of his mother's death, obviously being sarcastic, and that is where we see the cracks begin to form, or we see the already there cracks in the relationship of Elijah and Percy. While exploring the mansion, Cigna definitely feels the presence of spirits. She feels like somebody is always watching her, and when she's walking down the hallways, she feels like the portrait's eyes are always following her, creating a very spooky setting. Cigna comes across a room covered in books and finds Elijah's desk where Lillian's obituary is sitting on the desk. She goes to pick it up, and as soon as she touches it, moss starts sprouting from the paper and curls around her fingers, and she immediately drops it, horrified. She goes into the hallway and hears someone crying from a room over here, but then she is drawn to this room over here, so she goes to this room and she discovers that it is Blythe's room, who is sick in bed. She introduces herself to her sick husband, but then makes an insensitive remark about Lillian's death, forgetting that not everyone is as familiar as she is with death, and then Blythe gets really upset and kicks her out, but before she does, Cigna's like, whose room is across the way? I hear crying coming from it, and she was like, oh, there's nobody in that room. That is my mother Lillian's room. This is when Cigna realizes that Lillian's spirit is haunting the manor. When she leaves Blythe's room, she runs into Elijah in the hallway, who is shocked by her eyes because her eyes are two different colors, and that is the same eyes that Lillian had. So he was like, oh my god, are you my wife's ghost here to haunt me? And then Marjorie intervenes, like, no, this is Cigna. Remember, you invited her to stay at her manor. And the casualness that Marjorie interacts with Elijah sets off alarm bells in Cigna's head that something else is going on between these two. Cigna's feeling haunted, and she ends up going outside to confront Lillian's ghost, and she writes in the ground, come to my garden and save her. Cigna thinks Lillian is referring to Blythe when she says save her, so she's thinking if she can save Blythe from death, that the spirit will leave her alone. So Cigna decides to go to the stables to enlist Silas's help in helping her find Lillian's garden. On the ride to the gardens, she ends up losing Silas, but she makes it to the gardens anyway, and when she is there, the gardens have this huge wall and they are locked behind a gate, and she wants to get inside, but she knows that Death can walk through walls. So then she starts thinking about how her touch in Death's presence, she was able to use his powers. So she thinks, okay, let me try to eat these Belladonna berries. I'm gonna summon Death and see if I can use more of his powers than just taking somebody's life. When she eats the Belladonna berries and Death is now in her presence, she starts to question him about his powers, and he says he was just as shocked as her and he really doesn't know what's going on with her powers, but that when she seems to pass the veil, she can see him and use the same abilities that he is able to use. He also tells her to not feel guilt over the death of her previous guardians because she always felt that she was haunted by death, and that is why all her guardians have died, but he tells her that is not her fault except for Magda's. Her touch did kill Magda, and that life is always about demanding balance, and that the reason that Blythe is still alive today is because she took Magda's life before she was ready. Death was prepared to take Blythe's life that night, but since Magda died before her time, he then saved Blythe because the earth demands balance. While Cigna is on the other side of the veil and she is trying to use Death's power, she manages to get through the gates of the garden and she sees Lillian's spirit, who tells her that she was murdered with poison and that same person is trying to kill Blythe. Cigna pushes Lillian for answers, but she doesn't react well to this, and Death steps in and tells her that when spirits are trying to recount their final moments, they get very erratic and you can't predict how they're gonna act. This is when our murder mystery kicks off because Cigna decides she has to find the murderer so she can save Blythe. After her encounter with Lillian's ghost, she ends up meeting back up with Silas, who tells her that the reason the servants don't roam the halls at night is because they hear Lillian's ghost crying, and that is the reason why Mr. Hawthorne is always throwing huge parties and soirees that last days on end, because he's trying to drown out the sound of her ghost crying. Cigna tells him a partial truth that she felt pulled to the floors by Lillian's spirit, and that she feels that Lillian was murdered and Blythe is next, and enlists his help to help her solve the murder. Cigna is reflecting on Lillian's death because she said she was poisoned with belladonna berries, but if you eat enough belladonna berries, they will kill you pretty much immediately. So she comes to the conclusion that someone was slipping a small amount of belladonna berries throughout her food and drinks over a couple months so that it was slowly killing her. She starts thinking of who would have potential motive to kill Lillian, and she thinks it could be maybe one of Elijah's ex-lovers or Elijah's brother Byron, who always had a thing for Lillian. She remembers seeing Byron at the soiree the night she arrived at the mansion, and he was very angry and not in a good mood, and Silas says Elijah and Byron were probably arguing because Elijah is in charge of running the family business, but ever since Lillian's death he has been running the business into the ground, and Byron, watching him ruin the family business, really wants to take over, but Elijah will not let him. Marjorie brings 3 girls over for Cigna to have tea with so she can start her debut into society. This is where we meet Diana Blackwater, Eliza Wakefield, and Charlotte Killinger. Charlotte and Cigna do have history from when they were kids, but Charlotte barely acknowledges her in her presence, obviously making it clear she doesn't want a lot of people to know about that. During their gossip and tea session, Eliza tells Cigna to watch out for her cousin, Lord Everett Wakefield, because he is also a new arrival, and she says to watch out for him as a new potential suitor. After her tea session, Death comes to speak with her and tells her that he wants to teach her how to use her powers, and she reluctantly agrees. Percy and Cigna go to Blythe's room to check on her, and she notices Blythe's tea sitting on the nightstand and decides to take a sip of it, and Cigna realizes that there is a trace amount of belladonna within her tea. Then Silas and Cigna sneak off to get into Gray's because she overheard Marjorie and Byron setting up a meeting there because Byron told her he had something there to persuade her. They overlisten on the meeting and realize Byron is just trying to convince her that Elijah is unfit to run the business and suggests that Marjorie should sleep with Elijah so that he will get his head back in the game and forget about his dead wife, to which she is absolutely horrified. She's like, I'm not doing that. What is wrong with you for even suggesting that? I am a proper governess, to which he slaps her in the face, and she is shocked by this. They go to explore the rest of Gray's and break into Elijah's office, and they read his letters and realize that he is purposely trying to run this company into the ground, and he does not want Percy to inherit Gray's. Due to spying in Gray's, she is late for her lesson with Death on how to use her powers, and they end up getting into an argument where she demands to know why he keeps killing her guardians, and he tells her because none of them are suited to her. They all treated her poorly and they were never looking out for her, so he killed them. Some time has passed, and then Death comes back to Cigna to warn her that Blythe is gonna die before the end of the week unless Cigna can find her a cure for the belladonna berries. Cigna gets Silas to help her search the library to read books to see if there is any sort of cure for these berries, and the ghost in the library, Thaddeus, decides to help Cigna, and he points her in the direction of a book, which leads her to figuring out that Calabar beans are the cure for belladonna berries. Cigna and Percy go into town to acquire this Calabar bean from an apothecary shop, but they're trying to keep it on the down low because they don't want anyone to see them coming out of an apothecary shop because they don't want people to start spreading rumors. In the apothecary shop, there's only one Calabar bean, which they purchase, but the shop owner tells them this is the last one and she's not going to be getting another for a while because they are very rare to come by. While they're out in town, they run into Eliza, Charlotte, and Eliza's cousin, Lord Wakefield, who insist or politely demand that they all have tea together. Percy starts to doubt Cigna's intentions, trying to place blame on her, like, my sister only got worse since you've been here. How do I know that this Calabar bean's really gonna work? It could be poisonous. But they end up giving her the remedy anyways, and it does work to help cure her, but now they really need to figure out who the murderer is because there's only one dose left of the Calabar bean, so they don't have a lot of time. Death and Cigna meet up for another one of their lessons, and Death tells her he has a theory to why she's able to access some powers when she's behind the veil, and that is that he thinks that she is a Reaper, and that when she dies as a human, she will become a Reaper and be able to access her full powers. Cigna's really confused by this because why would fate create another Reaper, especially because Death never started out as a human, he was always Death himself. So she is like, well, why was I born a human, but then when I die, I'm going to become a Reaper? After their lesson, Cigna goes to the library to thank Thaddeus for helping her find that cure for Blythe. When she goes in there, she discovers a lot of books burning, and Thaddeus is so distraught over this, he ends up possessing her body. Death comes to save her, and then Cigna thinks somebody is definitely trying to send them a message by burning the books that she found the cure in. It is now time for the Christmas ball. Blythe is getting better, and she gives Cigna a very beautiful mask, and the reason that this is relevant is because on the cover of the second book, you see the mask that Blythe gave her. At the Christmas ball, Percy drinks a glass of champagne and then collapses into the Christmas tree. Cigna is freaking out, and she is like, oh my god, I think he has been poisoned by a belladonna berry, so she uses her last dose of the Calabar bean to cure Percy. And this is when Elijah suspects somebody is trying to target his family. Cigna decides to eat the belladonna berry so she can access her death powers and becomes a shadow, this enigmatic being who's able to sneak around the house undetected and snoop around and figure out what's going out. This leads her to going into Marjorie's room where she finds her journals and thinks that Marjorie has been in love with Elijah this whole time and she is the one who killed Lillian. And then while she's doing this, she comes across Marjorie herself and realizes that her hands are stained with belladonna berries, so she goes and tells everybody that Marjorie is the killer and she has solved the case. Blythe is not doing better, and now the Calabar bean is gone and Death comes to take Blythe, but Cigna begs him not to, and he says, okay, I will leave her alone, but then someone else has to die because life and death demand balance. While this is all going on, Cigna tells Elijah to demand that Marjorie remove her gloves so he can see the stains of the belladonna berries on her hands, which he does, and then he kicks her out of the house. After all this transpires, Death is waiting for Cigna in her room, and he tells her he cannot do that again. If it is Blythe's time to die, then he has to take her. He cannot put it off and just take somebody else who was not meant to come anymore. It was a one-time thing, and then he says, I want you to see what the afterlife is like so you won't fear death as much. So he takes her to the bridge where the souls cross over to the afterlife, and it is just a really beautiful place, and she sees the 80-year-old man who died in place of Blythe. And during this moment, Death and Cigna finally declare their love for each other. I love them so much. Cigna has a sit-down conversation with Elijah and Byron, and during this conversation, she learns that Percy is actually Marjorie's son. Marjorie and Elijah had a son, Percy. Because Marjorie was pregnant out of wedlock, her family disowned her, so she showed up to Elijah's house while he was already with Lillian, and they decided to take Percy in and raise him as his own, and then also hire Marjorie so that she could be around his son, but she was never to say anything to anyone that she was the true mother. Elijah also admits in this conversation the reason he is driving Grace into the ground and he is prohibiting Percy from taking over the company is because Elijah himself drowned himself in work and he didn't want his son to suffer that same fate. So while he has been running the business into the ground, he's also looking for a broker to sell the business. But Cigna abruptly runs away from this conversation because Death tells her to go to Percy's room, and then of course Elijah and Byron follow, and they find Percy with his eyes hollowed out, staring out the window and saying he just saw Lillian's ghost. Then Percy disappears, so Cigna goes to the stables to have Silas come with her to search for Percy. As they're riding on horseback, it is snowing, and they see Percy's trails going one way, and then Cigna sees another pair of footprints going a different way, so they decide to split up. Cigna goes after these footprints, and then Silas goes to find Percy. She finds the owner of those footprints, who are Charlotte, who is in the woods, and she is confused by this, but then she remembers that Blythe said she lives just on the opposite ends of the wood, and Charlotte tells her like, hey, I'm sorry for not really reaching out to you, but like when we were friends, our friendship ended due to a scandal between your mother and my uncle, and if people knew in society what happened back then, they would not accept me, so I just don't want people to know about her past. So they're just kind of having this nice moment, and then they see smoke coming from the garden, and then Cigna freaks out and she tells Charlotte, please go get Elijah, we need help, and Cigna takes off for the garden. When she gets to the garden, she sees Percy holding a tinderbox and she starts to piece everything together. She's like, hey Percy, what is going on here? And then he admits to starting the fire in the garden, starting the fire in the library, and also the person who poisoned everybody, including himself. He set the fire in the library so that he could put it out and be the hero. He poisoned himself because he was searching for the last dose of the Calabar bean and he couldn't find it. So he knew if he poisoned himself that Cigna would use the last dose on him. That way he could just be free to murder his sister. Lillian's ghost is there because they're in the garden. She goes enraged and she ends up possessing Cigna's body, and she demands answers from Percy about why he killed her and what she did to make him hate her so much. And then he is distraught and he was like, you are not the one who is supposed to die. He admits that the tea that he poisoned laced with belladonna berries was meant for Marjorie because she told him that he was her son and he was not having it. He was like, oh my god, this lady is gonna ruin my life. I was bred out of wedlock, like this is just gonna ruin me. I can't have her telling people if we have a relationship, then she's gonna want people to know. And he's like, people can already know that we are related just by looking at us. So he was just trying to take care of the situation, get her out of the picture and poison her. But then Lillian drank the tea, and then he realized Lillian drank the tea when she started vomiting up blood, and then he just didn't know what to do. So then he started slowly lacing all of her food and drinks with these belladonna berries so that she would slowly die and no one would think she was murdered. It was just an illness that took her. And then he thought if he poisoned Blythe, it would take his father out of the grief he was going through with his mother and make him focus on his sister, make him focus on what is important, his sister, the business, and get out of the grief he was going through. But of course that didn't happen the way he planned. And now Percy is like, this is why I'm burning this garden, because Lillian's ghost is haunting me. I do not want that. If I burn the garden, I burn where her body is, then the ghost will no longer be. Percy is giving his villain monologue speech and he's like, my plan was working until you showed up, Cigna. And then he takes a knife and he tries to stab her with it. Silas pushes her out of the way and then he stabs her in the arm, but then he takes it out and he goes to stab her again, and then Silas puts out his hand, the knife hits his leather glove and does not pierce it. Cigna is so confused by what is going on, and then Silas transforms into Death himself. When Death is there, he tells Cigna that she is a Reaper and she has three options. She can let Percy go and hope that he becomes a better man. He can turn Percy into the constable where he is sure to be hung. Or she can claim Percy's life for herself and take his remaining time and give it to Blythe. And that is the option that she goes with. She uses the full force of her powers. The roots and vines come up from the ground. They strap Percy to the floor. And then she lets Gundry, Silas's dog, who is actually a hellhound. Well, I don't know that he's a hellhound. I'm calling him a hellhound. And then he transforms into this big beast and he eats Percy. Lillian's spirit thanks Cigna for all she has done. And then Elijah comes to the garden as this is happening and he feels Lillian's spirit, her presence. And Cigna, she doesn't admit that she can see her, but she kind of does subtly admit it. And she was like saying, she loves you. She will always be with you. And then they have this really beautiful goodbye moment. Once they arrive back at Thorn Grove, Death admits that he was portraying himself as Silas because in the beginning, Cigna really hated Death and blamed him for all her problems and everything that happened. happened. And he was like, if I came to you in my natural form, you wouldn't trust me, you would be fearful of me. So I came to you as Silas because you needed help and I wanted to be there for you. He also tells her that Silas was invisible to everyone at the manor except her, so nobody even knew that he existed. And Cigna comes to terms with herself and finally accepts that she is a Reaper. Time is passing. Now that Percy is gone, Blythe is finally healing and she is going to be okay. Marjorie returns to collect her belongings and she talks to Cigna, who apologizes for wrongfully accusing her, and Marjorie's like, I understand, I had the Belladonna berries on my fingers. She's like, I found the berries and I realized what Percy had done. And then Marjorie asks Cigna if she's ever going to see Percy again, to which Cigna responds that Percy will never show up at this manor again, so Marjorie moves on to go live a life elsewhere. But to everybody else, Percy has just run away. Cigna has never told anybody what happened with Lillian's spirit and death in the garden, so she has made everybody believe that she had never seen Percy, she never saw who started the fire, and Death has whispered in the ears of all the servants at night, putting out the story that Percy ran away fearful that someone was trying to kill him, and also out of anger because his dad was running grays into the ground. Death comes back to Cigna to tell her now that Blythe is healing, there is no longer the veil between life and death within Thorn Grove because everything is okay now. So he will not be around her as much and he wants her to live her life and he will be waiting for her at the end of it. This story ends with another ball being thrown at Thorn Grove, and Blythe is now in attendance now that she is fully healed. And who is also in attendance but Lord Wakefield, the man who is trying to court Cigna throughout the whole book. He introduces her to his father, Julius Wakefield, and then Julius walks up to Elijah where they create a toast and talk about their partnership. Elijah is entering a partnership with Julius Wakefield so they can both run Grace together. They toast his champagne, Julius downs his champagne, and then he dies on the floor. Cigna runs over there and she realizes he was poisoned, not with Belladonna berries, but something else. And then Death comes back, and then Fate whispers in her ear and says, you have another murder to solve. And that is the end of Belladonna by Adalyn Grace. I absolutely love this story. I thought it was so much fun. It was the perfect YA gothic fantasy. I am so excited to see what is going to happen in Foxglove book 2 of this series, because during Belladonna, when Cigna was trying to save Blythe's life and she told Death to claim the life of another in order to save Blythe, after that he warned her not to play God and not to mess with Fate. And now Fate comes in at the end of the story to tell her that she has another murder to solve. Like, there is so much going on there and I'm very excited to see how it plays out in book 2. I rated Belladonna 5 stars. I have high expectations for book 2 and I think it's going to be a really fun time. I hope you guys enjoyed this little plot summary recap of Belladonna so you are prepared to go into book 2 refreshed and remembering everything from everything that happened in book 1. Thank you guys so much for watching. Subscribe down below for more plot breakdowns, and I'm also going to be doing a reading vlog of Foxglove because obviously I'm going to have to share my thoughts since I loved Belladonna so much. So if you're interested in any of that, subscribe down below and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye! All these